welcome to Cities on the Frontline. My name is Francis Guesquer. I'm the practice manager for the Urban Development and Disaster Risk Management team of the World Bank in East Asia. Today's topic is resilient infrastructure. We have two fascinating speakers, two good friends that Lauren will introduce in a minute. But before we start, as is now a tradition, let me remind everyone of the intention of this speaker series and the ground rule for the conversation today. The purpose of this global webinar is to have an open and honest learning conversation between practitioners in cities and government and partners supporting those entities. The calls are not on the record, so we ask that you not attribute any comments made today unless you have the person's express permission to do so, and we will be happy to obtain the permissions for you. We have more than 400 people registered for the call today. So to facilitate the discussion, we ask that you use the Q&A function to pose your questions. And please note that the recording of this session, as well as the PowerPoint presentation, will be posted online next Monday. Lauren, over to you.
Thank you, Francis. It's wonderful to be here as always. Tonight, we're going to be talking about how resilient infrastructure is being defined across the globe, how it's being financed, and also how it's being advanced in the project level in different places. Infrastructure in our cities is critical, and there are a few trends that make it even more so now in 2021 than ever before. We know that here in Asia Pacific, where Francis and I are speaking to you from, and also where Henri's speaking to you from, that over 50% of the infrastructure that's required in cities is not yet built. We also know that we have a sense of urgency around climate and the kind of infrastructure that we build today that will last us for a generation. Also, we see that around the world, we're focusing on resilient recovery, and that many governments are embedding resilience into their COVID-19 recovery and stimulus. And we're all preparing for continued economic transitions due to technology and many other factors. So achieving multiple benefits such as equity, climate resilience, carbon neutrality, and job creation are all embedded in our infrastructure journey. And so tonight we have two excellent speakers who are with us who are going to help to explain what's essential for resilient infrastructure and then how it's being implemented in cities on the ground. First, we're going to hear from Henri Blas, who is the Chief Content Officer of the Global Infrastructure Hub. And Henri joined the GI Hub in July 2020 and leads strategy and delivery of content initiatives and research tools and products at the Hub. And prior to joining the Hub, as many of you will know, Henri was the Resilience Finance lead with us at Resilient Cities Network. And he was previously with AECOM, leading infrastructure advisory here in Asia and advising on asset valuation, sales and acquisitions for Macquarie in North America before that. And he is a graduate of ENTPE in France and also has a Master of Science from New York University. After Henri, we're going to hear from one of our Chief Resilience Officers. We'll hear from Jim Murley from Miami-Dade County. He was appointed CRO by Mayor Carlos Jimenez in November of 2015. Jim previously served as Secretary of the Department of Community Affairs under Governor Lawton Chiles, and he was appointed Chair of Florida Energy and Climate Commission by Governor Charlie Crist. He also served as Executive Director of 1,000 Friends of Florida, spent over 10 years with Florida Atlantic University overseeing research on urban and environmental issues, and served as Executive Director of the South Florida Regional Planning Council. Jim is a founding member of American Society for Adaptation Professionals and Resiliency in Florida, and a board member of the Florida Ocean Alliance and Southeast Coastal Observing Regional Association. He is also a fellow at the National Academy of Public Administration. We're so thrilled to have you both with us, Henri and Jim. We are going to start with a presentation from Henri. So I'm going to turn the microphone and the screen over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. Can Can you hear me?
The audio is a bit faint.
Oh, really? Okay. And can you see the slides, or is it like a...
We can see the slides, not yet in presenter mode.
Go there. Is the sound there?
That's a little bit better.
Okay, and starting the slide. So, well, before the slides start loading, is that the right one, or is it reverse in presentation mode?
Just flip it.
Flip it again. Okay. If I can do that. Okay, that should do, right?
Excellent.
Perfect. All right. Sorry for that. My computer is a bit slow. So first, thanks Lauren for the introduction, and obviously, personally, we're very happy to be back presenting in front of this great network of resilience practitioners in cities. So today I've got a presentation, so really focus on what the G20 is doing around infrastructure, but really trying to sort of highlight some key insights or some key potentially advice and trends that could be interesting for you as practitioner for resilience. So first of all, so there'll be a lot of slides. I'm not going to go into details of all of them, but I'd be happy to sort of share the presentation later on for those of you that are interested into learning more. So first of all, just very quick background on what the Global Infrastructure Hub is. So we're the dedicated infrastructure entity of the G20, and we support them. We support the infrastructure working group of the G20 on their agenda around sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure. Resilient in there is actually really in the G20 objective. So that's definitely one of the key priority of the group. So it's a global mandate. Even though we work more with the G20 countries, we're really trying to help every country around the world. In terms of what we do as an organization, so I think it's important to mention that we don't work on projects per se or with particular countries. We really sort of help with two types of audience. The most important one is the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors. So really, when we say resilient infrastructure, we're really talking about the finance aspect. So we're supporting those finance ministries and again central bank in understanding the key trend and the key opportunities around infrastructure. So to do that, we gather data, we support the agenda and build coalition, and we also develop tools that can be useful for them, but more importantly for finance practitioners. So essentially, you in the audience that either are directly resilience finance practitioners, or you're working with some of them. Some of those tools could be useful. So that's essentially kind of what we do as an organization. So first of all, G20 and resilience. So as I say, resilience is one of the key objectives, and it's actually in the quality infrastructure investment principles that were agreed by the G20. So that's kind of like the general framework. Now, what is it that we've seen recently? What are the interesting trends around the G20 resilience? So the first thing is obviously with COVID, there's been a lot of stimulus related to infrastructure, and we'll see the data that we've gathered this year working with governments across the G20 to look at their priorities. So I'll give you some interesting statistics as to how resilient sort of fared within those stimuluses. So that's kind of the first one, and we'll see that definitely compared to the last crisis, there's been a strong increase in the resilience focus of those stimulus packages. The second one is looking at the G20 work around the financial markets. So we see the G20 because of the presence of the central banks is heavily involved in shaping financial markets so that they actually focus on the right type of projects, especially around infrastructure. So I'll mention a couple of interesting trends there that could be that you may want to integrate or highlight in the project that you're currently working on. The third one is something that we're not directly involved, but something that stay tuned. The OECD this year, in partnership with the World Bank, is actually working on a document that is actually really focused on resilience, and the strategy is to strengthen infrastructure resilience and maintenance in countries. So I'll just share some quick highlights from that draft report. It'll only be available in September, but it's an interesting one. And the last one is sort of mentioned that we are supporting the G20 this year in creating the Infra Challenge, which is essentially a challenge to highlight new innovation, new technology that could help create better and this year better infrastructure. And this year the focus was on resilience. So hopefully some of those new ideas and innovation could be interesting for you in terms of addressing some of your needs. So let's start with the first one. So resilience and COVID recovery packages. So essentially at the beginning of the crisis, I mean mid-crisis, let's say mid 2020, and to the end of 2020, some priorities sort of emerged for COVID. Definitely, the governments want the pressure to start thinking about a sustainable and resilience recovery, but they also had to look at local job recovery, and they started to see the emergence of fiscal challenges. Obviously, a lot of money was going to supporting households, etc., and so obviously the fiscal space is quite constrained, and so that means there's a renewed focus on private capital to address the resulting fiscal challenges. So that's essentially where the G20 and the countries were probably about sort of 6 months ago, and then infrastructure investment kind of emerged from that as kind of a potential mechanism for what we call a transformative recovery. The reason why infrastructure is actually kind of interesting is that research that we have done, looking at thousands of estimates from previous studies, has shown that actually infrastructure investment is a lot more efficient than other type of public spending at sort of creating economic activity. And so obviously we're not advising government to just invest in infrastructure for the sake of creating economic growth, but we thought that there's also an opportunity for that infrastructure spending to be done differently and to be transformative. And that within that transformative aspect, the resilience aspect was pretty important. So where are we now? So one thing that we did for the G20 this year is creating that tool, Infra Tracker, that will be available publicly online in September, and essentially going through all the G20 countries and look at all the stimuluses that have been announced for COVID. And so I'm just going to share with you some numbers. I can't unfortunately share all the numbers with you. Ooh, I see that it doesn't show. Yeah, okay, sorry. So essentially what we're seeing now is actually very substantial numbers. So that was up until March, we're talking about $2 trillion. So obviously in the US, there's been some recent addition that have increased that number, but that's very significant. So 3% of GDP, that's usually what governments spend on infrastructure overall. So definitely that confirms the focus on infrastructure. Social infrastructure was actually the biggest one, and that's really a stark contrast to business as usual. So really, there's a lot of announcement coming around social infrastructure, and obviously a lot of need to shape those investments the right way. A lot of greenfield investments, so new infrastructure. We see also a lot of maintenance work and sort of upgrading of sort of social infrastructure. And sustainability was one of the key things. So here you see some of the recent announcements that were probably useful when it comes to urban resilience around sort of housing, building, social infrastructure again, and urban transit systems. Within that, resilience was maybe disappointingly one of the lowest in terms of like transformative aspect of those packages, but again, if we compare that to the 2009 crisis, it's actually a massive increase, and resilience is actually now on par with inclusivity and sort of R&D and new technology. I think it's really sustainability that sort of has really been like the focus, and we'll see that it's not only within governments, also within private sector, but overall a much stronger focus on resilient infrastructure, especially around water and energy. So those are the key numbers here. You have some of the examples, and you see again that breakdown by sector, and so we see that everywhere, whether it's sort of developing countries or sort of more developed economies. There's definitely integration of resilience in most of those packages. So I think I'll stop there for the government, and so let's now move on to the private sector and the financial system in general. So what's happening at the multilateral level? I think it's fair to say that, as I mentioned, resilience is sort of popping up as a key element within government stimuluses. We also see that when it comes to financial markets and the future regulation. At the moment, climate resilience definitely sort of still the show compared to the other aspect of holistic resilience. Whether it's the G20, whether it's the Financial Stability Board and other type of initiatives, is very, very strong focus in aligning all the standards and making sure the financial system is actually directing investments toward the right type of project and also pricing the climate risk in all the investment decision making through disclosure, but also sort of creating new ways of looking at projects. So essentially, I think it's fair to say that going forward, the climate risk of project will be taken into account heavily by finance markets. And I think we're going to hear from Miami right after my presentation about one of those examples that I think they just experienced. So just to say that this is actually, if anything, that's going to accelerate. And this year, we have seen, an amazing change and an amazing wave sort of coming up, and actually including those risk and aspect into finance markets. So on that, the bad news, while there's a very strong focus towards more, I guess, ESG and incorporation of climate risk, is that actually it's actually very difficult to get to write the right type of project in front of the investors. If we look at the primary market, which is essentially new infrastructure, actually the total private investment has gone down over the past 10 years. What you see at the top is secondary market, which is essentially sort of assets moving ends. So, getting a brownfield that is already privatized, changing hands, very easy. To get a new project that actually tick all the right boxes, is bankable, and incorporate now those ESG factors is very difficult. So I think while private finance is there and there's very strong appetite from the private sector to basically invest in projects, it is not an easy feat. And what we've seen is actually things have kind of gone down. So that's the reality. And obviously, there's a lot of initiatives that sort of trying to address that. The MDVs are trying to put more effort into project preparation. There's some great initiatives such as the chair that was announced on resilient infrastructure by the Resilient Cities Network that will definitely help sort of address that trend. But this is where we are in terms of the finance market at the moment. Among that, the one that's actually collapsed the most is unfortunately social sector. So while the public and governments are investing more and more in social sector at the moment, getting private finance into those type of projects is increasingly difficult. It's a lot easier to do that for other type of infrastructure such as transport, renewables, and I would say water, but this is still not that easy. So really energy and transport, that's sort of the easiest one. Okay. So I'm not going to finish on the bad news, obviously. The good thing is when it comes to awareness and sort of interest in sort of resilience and ESG more generally, what we've seen is that private investor in infrastructure, and usually those are bigger institutional player, they actually among the leader when it comes to the adoption of ESG ratings. And here we have the equivalent of the G20 for the top 20 private investor in the world when it comes to infrastructure. And you can see that the ESG score, which is partly relative, so that means that actually getting better versus the other sort of corporates, has actually gone through the roof over the past 5 years, to the point where even if you look at the lowest of all those investors, they're now among the best when it comes to ESG ratings. So essentially what it means is that if you have the right project at scale, there's actually really sort of strong appetite because they actually do need to get those, they do need to get the right type of projects. It's actually kind of difficult nowadays for private investors to find those projects because they actually have to sometimes disqualify projects on the basis that in 10 years, they believe those projects will not be ESG compliant, will actually not be refinanceable. So essentially, because infrastructure is a 30 years type of project, you kind of need to take the long view, and they're afraid that in 10 years time, actually those projects that looks okay today will actually not be financeable in the future, hence they're turning them down. And that is it's a massive change that we're seeing across the board, and I think it's, if anything, is going to accelerate. Okay, so now we've looked at sort of the governments in general, the finance markets in the other part. I think what really transpires from that is a lot of appetite to basically shape the right type of project. And I think whether it's government or whether it's private sector, now is the moment to basically shape, get them in front of those investors. And I think, again, if you have the right type of project, the right planning, those projects will find people to fund them. So when it comes to resilience and infrastructure in project themselves, as I said, this year, the G20 is working with the OECD and the World Bank, coming up with advice on how to sort of put together the right type of project. That report is not public yet, but it will cover the sort of 5 points that I'm mentioning in that slide. I guess the two key advice that sort of that comes out of that report, and those are sort of previous insights, so I'm not sharing anything new here, is really sort of making sure that the economic opportunity around resilient infrastructure is clearly stated in everything you do. Here there's an example of sort of return from the World Bank, shows like 1 to 4 return on investment. That's obviously something that will be very important for public decision makers. Another one is when it comes to changing the way infrastructure is being thought of or delivered. Public procurement is key, and making sure that in UCD or in any way you work, that the long-term view on cost is actually included is very important, because obviously resilience usually sort of becomes interesting once you start looking at sort of 30, 50 years and the associated risk. And too often still, we see a lot of places where, even the maintenance sometimes are not really included. So it's really just the CapEx cost. And obviously, if your procurement is only based on that, it's very little chance that resilience will be incorporated into those procurement. So very basic advice, but I think that report has a lot more interesting aspect. On our end, so we have a lot of tools you can look at our website. Two that I'm just going to very, very briefly highlight. The first one is on innovative funding and financing, which I think could help you look at innovation when it comes to projects. So we don't really only focus on resilience projects, but in general, funding and financing innovation that may be helpful if you're struggling to basically put together a bankable project. And the second one is on inclusive infrastructure and social equity. It really gives the broad spectrum on how to integrate those aspects into the design of and the funding of the type of infrastructure. So the first one, innovative funding and financing, is really to help develop projects with what we call attractive risk-weighted return profiles. So essentially the project that will be attractive to investors. I won't go into the detail. You can look at it. You get the link there. It gives you a framework and also 50 examples of different type of innovation that could be useful for practitioners. So again, I won't go through the framework, but you can feel free to have a look at it on the website. And we're expanding that case studies with more on sort of circularity, circular infrastructure and green infrastructure this year, and some on the foreign exchange risk mitigation as well. So those are kind of the case studies. And the last tools I wanted to mention is inclusive infrastructure tool that presents a framework to incorporate inclusivity into the infrastructure throughout the project lifecycle. And the last but not least is, please feel free to also look at the solution that we've selected. So we had 100 applicants, 100 sort of startups that essentially, not only startups, actually sometimes established players that sort of came up with new technology, new innovation to basically put more resilience into infrastructure. Among that, we've selected the top 20, and we'll continue to work with them to basically sort of get those innovation to market. So if you have any interest, or if you want to reach out to some of those, feel free, and otherwise stay tuned to look at the winners. And I'll finish on that. Thank you so much.
think Lauren is disconnected, so we're going to move straight to Jim. Jim, I think the screen is yours.
Francis. Well, Andre, your presentation was so informative. I wanted to cede my time so I could go make you go back and go over some of those slides. That was fantastic. Thank you, and thank you to Resilient Cities Network for allowing me to make this presentation. I'm thrilled to see the focus on infrastructure. It's particularly appropriate, for those of us in resilient CRO positions or comparable positions around the world, because we're often involved in the process of getting to decisions about public or private investment. I think it's particularly timeful in the sense of the recovery area, and I'm very supportive of the Resilient Cities Network's board chair. The goal, his challenge to all of us, that resilient, climate-ready infrastructure that is equitable and produces green jobs is our focus. And so that's sort of our goal also here in Miami-Dade County. I'll be speaking on behalf of Miami-Dade County. We're the 7th largest county in the United States. There are 3,000 other county units of local government. But my presentation is really reflective of our ongoing partnership with the cities of Miami, City of Miami Beach. We participated in 100 Resilient Cities as a partnership. So my work here is a collaboration, although I will speak as a county official. Next slide, please. So, the geography always dictates the way you look at the long-range investments you have to make. And the peninsula of Florida obviously is surrounded by water, the Atlantic to our east and the Gulf of Mexico. That means that starting in a few days, June 1st, we'll be in a 6-month hurricane season. So a lot of what we do is reflective of our position in the latitudes and how we have to understand that level of vulnerability. Now enhanced by and amplified by sea level rise and other longer-term climate change impacts. We're at the bottom of that peninsula, but even in that case, we're surrounded by water. To the west is a large freshwater ecosystem called the Florida Everglades, which is undergoing massive infrastructure investment as ecosystem restoration. And of course, our focus often is in the populated areas of our county where we have over 3 million people and 34 cities that we partner with as we work on our resilient projects. Next slide, please. So again, we have to think about our investments across a transect, if you will, starting at our ocean and beaches. And our beaches are infrastructure. So that's a constant investment we make to produce multiple benefits from our sandy beaches facing the Atlantic Ocean. That's our main protection from coastal storm surge on our barrier islands. So while they're maintained for recreation and other environmental purposes, the investment in infrastructure comes from their ability to deliver protection from storm surge over the long term. And then across that transect going to the west, it goes all the way again to the Everglades, but it includes agriculture and many different ways that the landscape is been invested in and frankly changed over the last 100 years. I would tell you right off the bat, Miami-Dade County and the cities and the population would not be here if 100 years ago we had not started to find a balance between managing the land relative to the water. And if we're here 100 years from now, it is because we maintained that ability to manage the land and our uses of it relative to a rising sea. There's lots of challenges in that, but I think that it's important to understand in our geography and perhaps other places in the world is that we're working on history as how we've dealt with this, and that's going to drive the way we make our future investments. Next slide, please. So I can't emphasize how important the document that we produced with the City of Miami, City of Miami Beach, the Resilient 305 strategy. 305 is the communications area code that is sort of one of the brands of our area. And it took place, we developed that plan in partnership with our adjacent counties. 4 counties over 10 years ago created the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact. And that ability to have that peer-to-peer relationship and support is tied into our research universities. We do so much at that level that we always credit our success at the county and city level to the fact we have these strong regional partnerships. Next slide, please. So as you break our multiple jurisdictions down into 34 large to small cities, it still leaves the county providing direct services and maintenance to over 1 million people. So this is sort of the way the United States looks on a map. If you take the city and county boundaries, it has nothing really to do with the way you manage water or how we deal with a lot of other issues. Political boundaries are set for a number of other reasons, but you have to have everybody involved. And so we have all of our 34 cities making a preliminary identification of which one of the 59 action items in the resilience strategy that they're going to help us with. And many of those relate to resilient infrastructure investments. Next slide, please. One of the main products that comes from our collaborative effort with our neighboring counties is our own regional projection of sea level rise. And when we talk about making resilient infrastructure investments in Southeast Florida, it's because we have come to grips with and realized that our future is driven by some form of realization of these curves, which are not strange to anybody who has to deal with the modeling that takes place at the IPCC or at our national levels. But the important thing here is that we took the national and international level information and brought it down to our region, assembled experts, and every 5 years they update this projection. And this is the only projection that we use in the region for modeling our long-term needs of infrastructure. So while in the past we might have looked at building a sewer treatment plant at one elevation because we knew of 100-year flooding, we're now having to raise that because we understand that the life of that project is 70 years. We're going to have to look at building those projects much higher and building that resilience aspect into an investment we were otherwise going to make. But I can't emphasize how important that this regional projection is, and it is updated every 5 years. Because when you communicate this to policymakers, their eyes glaze over if you tell them 2100. But if you make the point that it's constantly being updated, then you get comfortable with understanding how to use these numbers. Next slide, please. We engaged in a study with the Urban Land Institute, which is an international land use policy research organization. We did it in partnership with our business community here in Southeast Florida. We wanted to make a case that a return on investment would occur if we invested both public and private dollars in the kind of projects that Henri was reviewing and the ones that we will be making here. These numbers are very important when you talk about whether or not that added money needs to be added to a public infrastructure investment or a private investment in order to protect it from the future impacts of climate change. Again, our partners on this were the business community. It was a messaging that we produced so that they could go to chambers of commerce and other organizations and build support for making resilient infrastructure investments. Next slide, please. The Office of Resilience is the point in county government where we look at all these issues. We're not the engineers or we don't take the infrastructure investments, but we operate across the 28 departments with other public and private partners and build an understanding about how those investments need to address a number of issues that come from our resilience strategy. Would be remiss if we didn't say that while we are addressing sea level rise in many of our investments, we have an equal responsibility to mitigate greenhouse gases. And we, like so many others, are trying to make that a goal of our work. And so we have a mitigation team. We have an adaptation team that looks at sea level rise and extreme heat and other impacts from climate change. Communications is front and center in everything we do, because if we can't explain to people the importance of these issues and why they should invest, then we really are just doing the studies for our own purpose. We have a particular focus on Biscayne Bay and extreme heat, and might be of interest to some of the audience that while I'm the Chief Resilience Officer, we now have a Chief Bay Officer and a Chief Heat Officer. And those new positions within county government are a direct result of a kind of familiarization of having a point of contact on certain issues within county government when you're dealing with so many different organizations and people. Next slide, please. One of the action items in the resilience strategy was to prepare a Miami-Dade County sea level rise strategy. And that was released in January this year. It's available online. And I won't go into it, but I want to make sure it's understood that it was an implementation item of the resilience strategy. Next slide, please. We set principles, which I think are very important on any document of this type, that we want to look at as we make the kinds of decisions that lead to infrastructure investments. We, like many places around the world, are particularly now and have been, and will be even more in the future, trying to understand the history of inequitable decisions that were made on investments in our community, and how we can correct that and make sure we have a more fair and holistic process in the future. Next slide, please. We had outreach in order to identify the main focuses of our eventual strategy. These obviously took place before COVID. As we had to experience COVID like everyone else, we made great use of the same technology we're using here this morning to continue to hear back from our citizens and other partners. Next slide, please. While we are focused on sea level rise in this document, we understand that what sea level rise is for us, perhaps around the world, is we often use a term that comes from the military, which is a force multiplier. It makes all of these other events that much worse. So it's not in itself an event, it's really a long-term stress. But these strategies, these impacts that we get from shocks and other activities are all going to be amplified by sea level rise. And that's how, when we make investments in these impacts, we're considering how sea level rise and resilience can relate to that. Next slide, please. In our sea level rise strategy, we have 5 approaches, which reflect again our history of how we've adopted our landscape. I would draw particular attention to the one where we build around transit and high ground. That's going to reflect a lot of other strategies that we have in terms of long-term planning for our region. It's very important that our strategy for adapting to sea level rise be in concert with other planning goals that are being invested in by our community, so they can understand how they complement each other. Next slide, please. So some of these approaches, again, relate to our geography. We're very impacted by any fluctuation in groundwater. And groundwater, when you see a canal in South Florida, and we have a lot of them, that's essentially exposed groundwater. With our geology of very porous lime rock, we have to adjust by pumping and other systems the level of the water to the land. So we have filled in the past, and we'll continue to use that in the future. Next slide. We'll elevate, which is when we say the Keys, that's the famous Florida Keys, an iconic string of islands to the south of our county. They have found their own way to adapt, and we'll mirror that in certain locations in our county as the water rises, which will first be indicated by a rise in groundwater. Next slide, please. I mentioned about building around transit, which is an ongoing priority for our community. Next slide. The canals and the greenways and blueways that are relate to them, and the parks that can be use of that area will be another focus of making that adaptation. And investments in these greenways and blueways are just as important as some of the larger investments that we make. Next slide. And our neighborhoods also will be adjusted in relationship to those changing conditions. Next slide, please. So I want to go over some of the key projects. Next slide. I won't go individually, but I'll really focus on how we present them. In the United States, we work closely with the United States Corps of Engineers on a lot of projects. The importance here from an investment standpoint is local government is looking to partner with the Corps on cost share from 50-50 on up to 65-35, and in some cases 100%. So the Corps is a very important partner in our infrastructure investment, and we try to coordinate our projects at that level. Next slide, please. We keep track of the projects we funded to be able to indicate how the county and other partners are making investments that relate to our sea level rise strategy. Next slide. And we're obviously careful to keep a list of projects that we don't have funding for that will allow us to be prepared when funding becomes available at either the state or federal level to partner for moving these projects to implementation. Next slide. We have key actions in our strategy. Next slide. And I want to focus just on one of them, which is called adaptation action areas. That's where we take all of the detail that I've described and go onto the ground at the curbside level, at the house level, at the street level, and start to understand how those broader implications relate to a neighborhood and how we can provide a long-term infrastructure investment plan for that area. We're currently working in an area along one of our canals. Next slide, please. This is essentially a watershed plan for our county. It's unique because it relates to the canals that are maintained by our regional water management system. And you can see the little river area in red. That's where we're focusing right now on preparing that area, which is already experiencing flooding due at high tides, the king tide flooding events, and when we have extreme rain events. Next slide, please. This is that scale that I was talking about that includes working with cities that we share boundaries and areas for. And next slide, please. Elevation has a lot to do with elevation's a relative term in Southeast Florida. If you're at 15 feet, you're high. So when you're at 5 feet, which is probably the areas in shades of blue, we know that we're going to have to focus on investments. This particular one is the Miami River, which really flows right through downtown Miami. Next slide, please. Where are we looking for funding to assist us? The state of Florida they finished a legislative session and put aside a resilient grant program of $600 million. I would note that $500 million of that is coming from the American Recovery Act, which is a national act that passed and is distributing funds at the county and city level. We have a $9 billion annual budget, and we look for any opportunity in that budget to adjust investments in infrastructure to make them more resilient. And finally, we're happy to see that the president just a few days ago announced another $1 billion towards really essentially grant funding to local governments to assist in mitigating damages before the storm, which is an important change in the way we have approached disaster resilience in the past. Next slide. Thank you. Look forward to a conversation, questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Jim. And thanks again, Henry. I want to kick us off with a couple of questions here. Both of you mentioned Mayor Sylvester Turner, the chair of our board's agenda that we recently released, and that is focusing on resilient infrastructure with a call to create equitable infrastructure and green jobs. And so to Henry, I would ask, in that increase that you spoke about, where resilience is becoming more mainstream in stimulus packages, where are you seeing the best kinds of criteria, or these various criteria being taken together to evaluate projects? Where is this being done most progressively? And to Jim, you laid out some really impressive implementation examples from the 305 strategy and the principles that you're using for inclusive and adaptive infrastructure. And as you mentioned, some of those adaptation modifications, they might take 50 or 70 years to show that you've made that right decision. But on the inclusive part, how do you know that you're getting to equity? How are you measuring that in some of the projects that you do?
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Lauren. It's a great question. I mean, I probably a reference of sort of a choosing country, or pointing to sort of one better than the others. But I think we're seeing there's a lot of emergence of what we call sort of new transformative frameworks at different levels that usually sort of are actually essential in creating the shovel-ready pipeline of projects. And I think there's quite a variety of countries where you had like huge announcements around sort of investments, but actually what we're seeing now is that those same countries sort of struggling to actually identify the project. And I think the one that sort of had those sort of the frameworks, to assess those projects and create a pipeline, but also the organizations. So I think a few countries have dedicated infrastructure, almost like planning bureau, sort of pipeline prioritization type of bodies that quite often, in the best cases, are actually not politically linked, and those are essentially sort of creating that sort of a pipeline of project and establishing the right type of criteria. The worst case scenarios is when things are not planned, and planning is we have a tool called InfraCompass that's sort of looking at how ready are countries when it comes to infrastructure, and we look at procurement, financial markets, governance, etc. And planning is the one that's actually the most the least improved over the past 3-4 years. So definitely sort of having the right bodies that can actually implement that sort of systemic planning that is essential to look at resilience. As Jim was showing, you kind of need to look at it from a system perspective. So if you don't have that embedded at the planning level, and then if you don't have the agency to sort of help prepare this project and creating that pipeline, that's where you end up in trouble. And even when the funds are there, which they are at the moment, because countries, they know they have to spend to recreate those jobs, they actually don't necessarily go to the right projects. So we're seeing the same old projects, gas, coal, fire plants, roads, maintenance, resurfacing, expansion, etc. In some cases, they may actually be required, but in many cases, it's just like to create jobs. But actually, you're missing out on this transformative element that can actually be included in there. So in September, we'll actually be releasing a compendium that's got all those sort of what we felt were the best sort of transformative frameworks to enable, to your point, choosing the right type of project and having the right type of frameworks. And that sort of highlights a few countries and a few aspects of this framework. So hopefully that'll be good guidance for practitioners and cities around the world.
Thanks, Henry. I think you highlight that money is waiting in the wings, and there are a lot of criteria out there. But if there's not that right capacity to prepare the projects, it's in trouble. And I think it resonates, Jim, with so much with what you said, that in South Florida, actually been thinking about how to do some of these kinds of projects for 100 years. And so you keep getting better and better at it. But let's go back to you on the equity in the infrastructure. How can you tell if you're getting that right?
Well, let me start by saying we're far from getting it right. We have a history, while we had a history of making those decisions on infrastructure, they did not consider, in many cases, they were at, you know, they were imposed on our communities of color and were unrepresented, from interstate highways to other facilities that the larger community decided to site in those locations. So we have to work our way out of a history of not being equitable in the way we adjusted and made those investments. And I think it comes now from leadership. Our mayor has set up an office of equity and engagement at her level that we all operate through. Yesterday, we had a half-day session on equity and resilience presented to us by representative of those groups in the communities and others that they choose to speak to our peers that are working in resilience in the region. So we have a lot of listening to do. We need to make adjustments as we proceed. Obviously, they want to be involved in the planning process. They're part of our community. They're not, and often they don't feel that that representation is there. So we have to build that into the way we plan and make the investments. We have to listen, and we have to give feedback as to how things actually are changing.
Nope. Jim,
I'm
are you
yes.
done? Okay, okay.
I'm done. I'm
Thank
sorry.
you. I wasn't sure. I couldn't really see
I
the
wanted
screen.
to make room for questions.
Yeah, we have plenty of questions. Let me first say I really like how you started by presenting beaches infrastructure. I think very often we forget that all these natural elements are really part of the protection of our cities. But also that you talked about the fact that Miami is still here today as a result of some of the decisions taken 100 years ago in finding the right balance between that natural environment and the city itself. And then finally, and that links to what you just said, the fact that this is part of a resilience building and a collaborative process with a lot of consultation. And I imagine that coordinating 34 cities is not easy every day. But I know you like real challenges. My question moves a little bit beyond those aspects and goes towards more the financing of all this infrastructure. And Miami-Dade recently got a AA bond rating from Fitch Ratings, and I think that's very important for a city like Miami-Dade, because you issue bonds, and if these bonds are cheaper, you can finance many more projects. And Fitch Ratings indicated that you get such a good rating because you had invested in developing a resilience plan against revenue stress. Could you elaborate on these aspects and you know, how was this done and what this plan included? And
well,
yeah.
I start by saying I'm not a municipal finance expert, but I can tell you that when our finance office has interactions with the bond rating and with others who are involved in make those decisions, they usually ask us to join them, so that when the conversation occurs, we're able to provide the information and help answer some of those questions. My observation would be probably that in the county government, especially in some of our municipalities, some of our services are provided through enterprise departments that rely on fees in addition to taxes to make, and that would be our water and sewer department or the airport or the port. So they have independent funding sources and revenue streams. And I think that those are carefully calibrated. The investments that are ongoing at the port and the airport are they hardly ever stop. And so the importance of it, putting both actions and investments that reduce greenhouse gases. Our mayor recently signed an agreement with the cruise lines that when they return to the port, we'll start a process of providing onshore electricity to the cruise ships. They used to come in and continue to burn in their boilers to produce electricity. Now we're going to work with our electric provider and provide the resources so they'll hook up to our grid, and we'll reduce that level of greenhouse gas emissions from those ships. That's a big activity in our cities. So it's the kind of step-by-step process that you make to reduce greenhouse gases. On the adaptation side. It would come most, as I mentioned in my presentation, you'd see it most evidence of that in our water sewer department's work.
Thank you, Jim. Moving on to you, Henri. At the World Bank, we've been lobbying for years to have rating agencies include resilience and different aspects of climate change into their rating. It's not been easy, but gradually, I think we see some of these appearing. And this is because we want to create incentives for municipal and national government to take this into account. I'm sure that a lot of similar initiatives exist to incentivize this kind of investment by companies or by the private sector in this kind of project. Could you elaborate on what you've observed in your area? You mentioned that there's a whole pillar of your work which is about the financing of infrastructure, of resilient infrastructure. And what do you think are the most effective incentives, in fact, to move forward on those agendas?
So I think there's been a lot of ongoing noise, positive noise, and acceleration, I think, of some of the movements that you're talking about. I think, this is not new per se, but I think over the past year, the most promising, the most visible event has been at the G20 level, the recreation of what is called the Sustainable Finance Working Group. That is actually co-chaired by both the US and China, and under an European presidency. So I think you get pretty much like the three sort of main blocks of economic blocks, sort of agreeing and sort of looking at that in a little bit more closely. And within that, it's called sustainability, but it's really around two angles, one around adaptation and the other one around mitigation. So when it comes to mitigation, I think there's definitely the pressure comes from the public in general, and more increasingly so the big institutions and the investors themselves that are having to basically take their own sort of carbon neutrality pledges. And I can tell you right now, among fund managers, the difficulty is actually translating that into actual projects. Because they know that they will have to get rid of some assets. They still need to invest more and more. And there's actually not a lot of projects that are sort of almost like guaranteed to contribute to a carbon neutral world. So I think on the mitigation side, there's definitely a massive pressure that's sort of coming up on investors, etc. That is not at the moment non-integrated usually in the way the ratings are made, but there's a lot of pressure to start incorporating that. On the climate resilience aspect and adaptation, I think as Jim was saying, I think that's already kind of, that's made its way through for at least at the asset level. I think in Miami, the airport got a sort of a more favorable bond ratings as well, because they incorporated those risks, and the municipal bond ratings are also sort of at the moment incorporating this. So I think we definitely see a movement, and the FSB and the CTFD sort of initiative that is done on the dam, as also is trying a lot of putting a lot of disclosure pressure to corporates and investors, and as a result, the rating agency are able to take that into account. So I think we're seeing a lot of recent movements toward on both sides, I guess, mitigation and adaptation when it comes to climate. Other more holistic aspect of resilience at the moment is to target to biodiversity and other aspects. It's something that's in the mind of most people that are working on the subject, but I think the materiality angle, if you want, the ability to actually quantify that risk is not exactly there yet. And I think it will take a little bit more time before we actually have the metrics that will enable the rating agency to actually translate that risk into financial terms. But it's definitely in the plan as well.
Thank you, Henry and Jim. I think we're getting to the end of the hour. I'm going to pass it back to Lauren to close. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you again on behalf of Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank to you, Henry, for coming back and joining us again, and to you, Jim, for joining us in your morning from Miami. It's hard to close down at this moment because just as we were getting into some of the nuances of resilience finance for the infrastructure projects, we're out of time. So I think we will have to convene another session on resilience finance and some of these costs that we are now seeing coming more into the mainstream, and those that are still, I think, as you point out, Henry, eluding us in terms of some of the nature-based solutions. So definitely something we can come back to, I think, for us and for the members of the network, as well as for the World Bank. Those are issues that are very high priority. So again, thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight, and to Jim and to Henry. We will be back in 2 weeks on June 10th with Advancing Community Resilience. We will have special guests from the University of Manchester, as well as Martha Herrera Gonzalez, who is the Global Social Impact Director from CEMEX and a member of the Resilient Cities Board, talking to us about advancing community resilience initiatives on the ground. So hopefully we'll see many of you back online with us at that time. And until then, stay safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye from Singapore.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Sydney. Bye-bye. Bye, Jim.